here today, Ken Silverstein, to discuss the findings in his new book, Private Warriors. Working as an investigative journalist and an associate fellow at IPS, Ken continues to be one of the most respected professionals in the business. He's a regular contributor to Harper's, The Nation, and Mother Jones. He's worked on 4 books, including Washington on $10 million a Day, How Lobbyists Plunder the Nation. The issue that Ken focuses on in his book, the U.S. post-Cold War military budget, is an issue that many here at IPS have worked on and in our In Focus project have worked on for decades. This year, President Clinton asked for $306 billion for the military. This is up from $292 billion last year. There is no defense justification for this. The United States and its allies now spend almost 3/4 of the world's military spending. We'll spend next year more money researching, developing, and purchasing new weapons than any other individual nation will spend on its entire military. We have no global rival. In fact, the Joint Chiefs, in their planning statement, admit that there is no military rival to the United States. In offering explanations for the U.S. enormous post-Cold War military budget, many defense critics point to the influence of weapon makers' pork barrel politics. But in this eye-opening book, Ken looks at another, all but unexamined force, private warriors, the generals, gun runners, and national security staffers who were cast adrift at the end of the Cold War and are now continuing business in the private sector. Today's private warriors have one thing in common, a financial interest in war and the connections to push for the continuation of Cold War military policy. Ken, we look forward to hearing your discussion. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Please help me welcome Ken Silverstein.
Thank you very much, Eric. Well, I start every book event by telling people what happened at the way to the first book event that I did, which was up at Dartmouth College, where my daughter was in the car. She's 5 years old, and she was with another 5-year-old girl, and they were debating whether to go to my book event or not. And my daughter, whose name is Sophia, said to her friend, "Well, this is really going to be boring." And they decided that with that was the end of the discussion. They decided just to bag my book event. So I hope that I can exceed my daughter's lowly opinion of me. I want to start just by talking about how the book originated. I was doing research a few years ago for an article in The Nation magazine about the privatization of military training, whereby there are a bunch of new private sector firms, some of them quite big, some of them just, $10, $20 million a year firms. And they have stepped in where the Pentagon used to be in terms of training foreign armies. The Pentagon, of course, still has an enormous program of its own, but sometimes the United States chooses to use private companies, like Military Professional Resources, Inc., out in Virginia, or Vanell, another Virginia firm. Most of the training firms, most of the big Beltway bandit firms are out in the Maryland or Virginia suburbs, and so there are a number of firms out there that do that sort of work. In any case, I was talking to one of my sources for the book, a guy named Dan Nelson, who used to work at the State Department, and he was a fellow at the Pentagon as well. And he said, this isn't just the private military firms. You ought to look at the whole issue of privatization. The Cold War is over. There's been tens of thousands of people who used to staff that Cold War bureaucracy, the generals and the gun runners, the spooks, etc. And there's been a downsizing, not of the budget, but of the personnel. And these people are trained in the art of war, paramilitary and military specialties. And so now they have to earn their keep in the private sector. And those people have a big influence on our policy, because in pursuing their own private interests, they influence the public debate, especially because they're generally very well connected. And so Dan Nelson really gave me the idea for the book and the authority to steal his idea, because he was too busy to do it himself. The term private warriors then refers to the folks who, as I said, they may have made their name and fame during the Cold War, and now they're off in the private sector. Real briefly, I'll give you 2 examples. Al Haig, who was, of course, Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and before that, Chief of Staff for Richard Nixon, made his name in government as someone who favored alliances with some of the world's most repressive dictatorships in the name of combating communism, so that he was always pushing for alliances with, for example, China or the regimes in Central America during the 1980s that the United States supported, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, very repressive governments. Haig, other than saying after Reagan was shot that he was in charge in Washington, which of course was wrong, is perhaps best known for when the 4 American churchwomen were murdered in El Salvador, and Haig had the audacity to appear before the press and suggested that they had run a roadblock, and that may have been why they were raped and murdered by the Salvadoran military. In any case, Haig cozied up to a bunch of repressive regimes while in power, and now in the private sector, he's located just a few blocks from here, actually, on 15th Street. He has a firm called Worldwide Associates, and he opens doors for American companies that want to do business abroad, and lo and behold, he finds that he's best able to open doors in those countries like China and Guatemala, Indonesia, Turkey, where when he was in government, he established personal relationships, personal friendships with government leaders there, and those government leaders were very grateful to him because he was always attempting to whitewash their human rights records, and as a policy say that the United States should have relationships with these countries, friendly relationships, no matter what their human rights records, because we had the big bogeyman of the Soviet Union. So Haig has made a lot of money opening doors in these countries where, as I said, he established ties while in government. Another guy I look at in the book is Frank Gaffney, who was one of the real hardliners at the Pentagon during the Reagan years. And he was a big promoter of Star Wars, the ballistic missile defense system. So what happens to Frank Gaffney? He leaves the Pentagon still during in the late Reagan years. He goes off into the private sector. He starts a think tank called the Center for Security Policy, which is funded primarily by arms contractors, many of whom benefit from the continuation of the Star Wars program, from the ballistic missile defense program. They pay his bills. And what is he doing? Well, his big mission in life is to maintain support for this program, which has cost $60 billion to date, and utterly nothing to show for it. I mean, the system hasn't shot down. There have been a couple of during testing, it's shot down a couple of missiles. I think it's about 2 out of 12, which is a pretty low average. But in the 2 cases where it actually succeeded in shooting down something, they rigged the test so that it couldn't really miss. So, you know, here again is a guy who made his name during for his role in government, his years in public service, and now is cashing in on his ties and his connections in the private sector. But I just wanted to briefly talk about Haig and Gaffney to give you an example of what I mean by private warriors. But for me, the most interesting part of the book, because it was really original, groundbreaking research, I think, if I can blow my own horn for a minute, was about a couple of arms dealers who worked for the U.S. government for many, many years. And what's important about it, beyond what, you know, the specific issues and beyond exactly what they did for the U.S. government, is the whole issue of a covert foreign policy and the need, as the CIA and the Pentagon see it, to run a secret foreign policy. And they need the black market arms traders to do this sort of thing because it's too embarrassing, for example, to support Chile during the Pinochet years. This would be too embarrassing to out and out sell arms to Pinochet. But one of the arms dealers I write about, Gerhard Mertens, who was a German, a man who was a Nazi war hero and ardently right-wing. In fact, he was one of the founders, or one of the funders of the Socialist Reich Party, which was the successor to the Nazi regime. He was someone who funneled arms to Chile during the Cold War when Pinochet was in power. And he did it with the knowledge, at least the knowledge and perhaps the out-and-out authorization of the United States. And so governments love these private arms dealers to handle embarrassing, controversial deals that we just can't do ourselves. They want to hide our official fingerprints. This has been going on for some time. The most famous arms dealer probably of the early part of the 20th century was a guy named Basil Zaharoff, who was a European, and he was a salesman for several Western arms My favorite story about him, this is sort of the classic sleazy arms dealer story. Zaharoff was representing a Swedish firm, I think, a submarine maker, in the late 19th century, and he traveled to Greece. And his roots are very, very murky. Nobody actually quite knows even where he was born or what year he was born, but he claimed when it was convenient that his mother was Greek. So he goes there, and he's trying to convince Greek officials to buy a submarine, and he tells them that he's not a salesman, he's a patriot, just like they are. But they desperately need this wonderful submarine because the Turks are so menacing to Greek security. And he finally convinces the Greeks to buy the submarine, upon which he promptly goes to Turkey and scares them with tales of this menacing new Greek submarine, and the Turks buy two new submarines of their own. And so this is sort of this is the way that the whole system worked in the early part of the century, where these black market arms dealers were not only salesmen, but they were policymakers in a way. I mean, they stirred up trouble and international tension because that was the best way of generating demand for the companies they represented. And I just want to read one brief quote from a book called Merchants of Death, A Study of the International Armaments Industry. This was back in 1934. And the authors wrote, "The international sale of arms has far deeper roots in the conscienceless greed of the arms makers. If all private arms makers decided to discontinue their international traffic tomorrow, a worldwide protest of governments would not permit them to do it." So this is something that was written, that's 66 years ago, and this is still very much the situation today. Governments need people like Gerhard Mertens, this guy who funneled arms to Chile, and the guy I'm about to talk to, named Ernst Werner Glott, to handle dirty business that we don't want to leave our fingerprints on. Chapter 2 of the book is basically a profile of the man I just mentioned, Ernst Werner Glott. He was a German, like Gerhard Mertens, very, very conservative, very right-wing. As a young man, he fought in the Nazi army. He was 17 when the war ended, and so I think it's a little bit unfair to simply label him as Mertens as an older man still supported the successor to the Nazi regime. Glott pretty much got over it, largely I think because his love for money superseded his love for fascism in a way, and he decided that the arms trade was a great way of making money. He did mellow considerably, though. His politics were still quite right-wing. He has his estates all over the world, 3 chalets in Switzerland, a big estate in Luxembourg. He has homes in Austria, London, an enormous estate in Scotland, and he has a farm down near Charlottesville, Virginia, called the Black Eagle, which, of course, is a symbol of the Nazi regime. I think for Glott, it really harkened back to Imperial Prussia, but it's a symbol of the sort of politics that he had. He worked for the United States government and continues to do so, but starting in the 1960s. And I talked to one of his handlers, a man who used to work for Army Intelligence, which was the main agency that Glott worked for. He did work for the CIA as well, but he really did most of his work for Army Intelligence. And I asked him if the government, the Pentagon, if anyone had trouble working with a man whose politics were so extremely right-wing. And he said, and I need to preface this by saying that Glott's specialty was procuring Soviet bloc weaponry, and I'll get to that in a minute, but he was expert at bribing communist bloc officials, buying up their weapons, and then sending it to our freedom fighter friends, the quote freedom fighters that the Reagan administration supported in the 80s. And so I said to him, didn't anybody have trouble with his politics? And this Army intelligence officer said, there were some people in government who felt Glott was not a nice man, but who cares? Western civilization required his services. Glott was viewed as a source, potentially our most lucrative source of Russian arms. We weren't considering him for citizenship. We were hunting for Soviet weapons that had great military value to the United States. The more virulently right-wing he was, the more we felt comfortable with him because we knew he wouldn't deal with the Russians. We weren't running a denazification program. If he wanted to call his farm the Black Eagle, that was his business. We weren't going to tell him what to name his property. Which I think is just a tremendously revealing quote. And from the point of view of its author, it's entirely logical, and people who I'm sure there are many people who would agree with that. But it's basically a recipe for running an amoral at best foreign policy where whatever works is okay. And this is, I guess, to me, it's the entire explanation for the way that the United States conducted its foreign policy during the Cold War, which was, well, Western civilization was at stake, and hence anything goes. And so no matter what we did in the name of democracy was acceptable, even if it was entirely anti-democratic. Now back to Glott. He got his start with Sam Cummings, who some of you probably have heard of. He was probably the most famous private arms dealer of the 50s and 60s. He was an army man, and after the Second World War, he created a company that was actually a CIA front company called Western Arms, and his cover story was that he was working for Hollywood producers who wanted to buy up all the surplus weapons in Europe to be used in American war movies. But in fact, what Western Arms was doing were buying up surplus arms and then funneling them to friends of the United States around the world. Cummings met Glott in the late 50s when Glott was a student at the University of Geneva. Cummings had a huge warehouse here in Alexandria, Virginia, but he conducted business all over Europe, and he had offices he was actually trying to open an office in Switzerland. He had a big office in London. He was in Switzerland when he meets Glott, and he convinces Glott to go to work for him. Glott becomes his vice president at Interarms, and then sometimes in the early to mid 70s, they have an enormous feud, which frequently happens between arms dealers. It was remarkable to me how often I found that these business partnerships ended in feuds and frequently lawsuits, which to me was wonderful because you could then go through the lawsuits and find out lots of useful information. There's just so much money at stake. I mean, other than cocaine or drug trafficking, you can probably make more money in the arms trade than anywhere else. And one of the arms dealers I interviewed, a man named John Miley, who supplied the CIA in the 80s, said that these relationships frequently ended in bitter feuds and lawsuits precisely because of all this money that could be made. And he said, you might tell your partner that you paid a $250,000 bribe to secure a deal, and you might even have the receipt to show that you paid that bribe. The only thing is that the government official you gave the bribe to kicked back 50% to you, and so there's a tremendous level of distrust, and everybody's fighting to get every last dollar out of this trade, and that's what causes all of these feuds. In any case, Cummings and Glott end up despising each other, at which point Glott is recruited by the U.S. government to basically continue doing what he'd been doing for Cummings, who worked for the U.S. government but really became somewhat of a private player. He was not strictly a tool of government policy as Glott was later to become. So he was recruited by the intelligence agencies. I'm not sure whether it was the CIA or Army intelligence. I don't know who first had him. I only know he ended up with Army intelligence. And he goes out, and as I said earlier, his specialty is procuring Soviet bloc equipment. He would go to the East Bloc, especially Poland and Romania, where he had excellent connections, and he would go to the state arms agencies in these countries. And every communist state had one centralized arms selling agency. And he'd pay off the necessary officials, and they would sell him whatever he wanted. There was a pretense that the stuff was not going to the United States or to the West, but in fact that's where it was always diverted. So there were two purposes to this. One, the CIA wanted this Russian stuff so that we could send it to, say, the Contras or the Mujahideen, our freedom fighter friends, because we didn't want them to have American stuff for a variety of reasons. One, if they've got U.S. stuff and the media comes in and sees a bunch of M16s, it sort of looks bad. Even if the world knows we're supplying these countries or these rebel groups, we have plausible deniability if it's Soviet stuff. After all, we don't make it. How would we possibly know how it managed to get there? The other reason is that you can't always ship in arms. It's not like, as one Special Forces veteran told me, it's not like you send this stuff in via FedEx. Supply routes are somewhat insecure, and so If you give the Mujahideen a bunch of AK-47 Russian assault rifles, they can rearm themselves on the battlefield, because every time they kill a Russian soldier, they can take his gun and they can take his ammunition, and we don't have to worry about sending our own stuff in. So that was one reason that GLOT was so valuable, was his role in arming our allies in the Third World. But also because he was the top supplier to a program called the Foreign Material Acquisition Program, which was a black program, a secret program, which still exists, as a matter of fact. And he supplied stuff to the FMA, as it's called, so that the Pentagon could test its own weaponry. I mean, you want to know, if you get into the battlefield, if your stuff is actually going to work, and the best way to test it is to test it against what it's going to be facing in the field. So GLOT and other arms dealers employed by the United States would go out and buy the stuff, whether it was a tank or a mortar shell or an air defense system, and then we would test it against our equipment to see if our equipment could defeat the Soviet what the Soviets would deploy as a countermeasure. And my favorite story about the FMA involves a helicopter, a Russian-made helicopter that the United States was desperate to get its hand on. It was a Hind helicopter, and they were used in Afghanistan by the Russians, and the United States wanted to know if its new anti-aircraft system called the DIVAD could take out one of these helicopters. So Army intelligence, they didn't use GLOT for this deal. They used an Israeli arms dealer who goes out and somehow bribes whoever he needs to bribe and gets this Russian helicopter and flies it into Alabama to a testing ground where they're going to have a test to match it up against the DIVAD. Now, the DIVAD was made by a subsidiary of the Ford Motor Company, and it was an anti-aircraft gun that sat on a chassis and swiveled on the chassis. When it heard the sound of Russian helicopter blades, it would home in on that sound and fire at the helicopter based on this acoustic sensing system that it had. It was way, way over budget. Billions of dollars over budget. The whole thing was a boondoggle, and finally they said, we've got to test it. So they go down to Alabama, and a bunch of generals and high-ranking officers are there, and somebody at the fort where they're going to test it decides that they better put a portage-on out by the field where they're going to test the helicopter. And this person who has this brainstorm decides that it better be a really good portage-on, because you don't want any unpleasant smells wafting over to the grandstands where the test is going on. So there's apparently some super fan on top of the portage-on. So even before, and this is really a true story, I mean, this is confirmed to me by an eyewitness, even before the helicopter is brought out onto the field, the DIVAD swirls on its chassis and blows the hell out of the portage-on. There was no one in it at the time, but this was pretty much the death knell for the DIVAD. They did continue the test, and they also found that the range of the Russian helicopter exceeded the range of the DIVAD, which meant that a Russian helicopter could just park itself out beyond the ground troops and blow them away without fear of being hit by the DIVAD. But Caspar Weinberger, who really never met many weapon systems he didn't like, after this test killed the DIVAD. That is the true story of why the DIVAD bit the dust. It's one of the only weapon systems in modern times that was killed after it entered into its production phase. This almost never happens, but when you shoot up a portage-on, it's pretty much the end of the line. Now, GLOT's, again, let me go back to a little bit of GLOT's personal history. His first big deal for the United States was in Somalia. And this to me is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because this whole deal had never previously been reported. And two, because it's sort of the classic way that a black market arms deal works. So let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about that. It's 1977. The United States is involved, of course, in this Cold War with the Soviet Union, and everybody is using the third world nations as proxies. Somalia has recently broken with the Soviet bloc and moved into the Western camp. Ethiopia, almost simultaneously, has moved from the Western camp into the Soviet bloc. And these two countries go to war over the Ogaden, a stretch of desert between the two countries. And there's a problem for the United States. We want to support the Somalis, but this is really a bad time to do it. The war in Vietnam has recently ended. U.S. withdraws in humiliation. The public, remember this is 1977, Ralph Nader, who's now maybe he'll get 5% in the presidential election. At the time, was a hero to millions of people. You had a whole different political climate at the time, post Watergate. The public didn't want any more overseas involvements. They didn't want any more Vietnams. So we can't do it overtly, so we decide to do it covertly. Hence, Ernst Werner Glatt is called upon. He goes first to Ethiopia. No, I'm sorry. He goes first to Nigeria. Nigeria at the time was aligned with the Soviet. It was neutral, but it was close to the Soviet Union. He goes there. He bribes somebody in the Ministry of Defense to give him a fake end-user certificate. Actually, it's a real end-user certificate showing that arms would be shipped to Nigeria, and the Nigerian government would not re-export these arms. It was fake because the arms were never intended to go to Nigeria. They were going to go to Somalia. But for any sort of black market arms deal, any arms deal at all, in fact, you have to have an end-user certificate. Governments demand it. Glatt has the end-user certificate in hand. He goes to Hungary, and again, he pays off the necessary officials there, and he buys 580 tons of arms, mostly small arms, mortars, assault weapons, etc. And he gives the Hungarians an end-user certificate saying the arms are going to be shipped to Nigeria, which is okay by the Hungarians because Nigeria is closely allied with the Soviet bloc. Whether government officials there really cared about that, I'm not sure, but they had to have that piece of paper for their file so they could cover their ass in case these Hungarian weapons turn up in Somalia. The officials would have to tell the responsible parties in the Soviet Union, well, we didn't sell them to the Somalis, we sold them to the Nigerians. How were we to know? In any case, Glatt bribes the necessary officials, and then a number of U.S. airmen are hired with Glatt's help. These are veterans of the Vietnam War and veterans of previous covert operations. They fly into Hungary. I'm told it was the first time an American plane had flown behind the, quote, Iron Curtain after during the Cold War. I'm not sure if that was true, but I was told this by one of the pilots. And they flew these 580 tons of weapons down from Hungary to Somalia. They overflew Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis gave us flyover rights, and this was a huge success. The world never knew that the United States was arming the Somalis. There were rumors at the time, but they were always denied by the Pentagon and Jimmy Carter, the president at the time. Everyone forthrightly denied that we were arming the Somalis. It just wasn't happening. And again, this is a classic example of how useful black market arms dealers are. We just can't do it. We cannot publicly say, and this is the whole problem, of course, with the secret foreign policy. If you can't sell it to your population, then you shouldn't be doing it, presumably. But the Pentagon and the CIA decided, well, the public doesn't want us to do it, but we want to do it, and that's what matters. And so, hence, they use Ernst Werner Glatt to do it. Glatt, throughout the Cold War, did a number of deals for the U.S. He armed the Contras. He armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. His first big deal for them, he bought a bunch of SA-7 surface-to-air missiles. They're Russian-made. He bought these out of Poland, again, with the requisite bribes. This was in 1980 or 81. It was before the CIA's program there really got geared up. That became a $1 billion a year program. But at the time, the CIA wasn't doing much, and so Army intelligence used Glatt to buy, I think it was 2,000 of these SA-7s, and they shipped them from Poland to Oman, and then they were diverted from Oman. The Omani government, like the Saudi government, would do whatever we wanted during the Cold War, and they still do pretty much. But they were diverted from Oman to the United States, to an Army depot. From the Army sent them to Pakistan to CIA bases, and the CIA shipped them into the Mujahideen in Pakistan. Across the border in Afghanistan. And Glatt has continued to do deals for the Foreign Material Acquisition Program. The last big one he did, that I know of, because it's not always easy to find out the latest deal. It's easier to find out about earlier deals, of course, because these are somewhat less sensitive. But I know in 1993, he and three partners bought some Russian torpedoes out of Poland and shipped them on a commercial flight to Detroit, and then again into Virginia to an Army base. These were to be tested to see if the U.S. could if our ships could defeat these Russian torpedoes. And so that, I think with that, I'll end with GLOT, and then I'll turn to the subject of private military firms. But to me, GLOT is just a fascinating subject because of not only because of everything he did for the United States, and for 40 years, really, he was probably the most important private arms dealers working for the U.S. and for supplying our black operations, our secret operations, but just because of what it shows about the way that our foreign policy has always been conducted in secret, and the reasons for it. I want to quickly turn. Can someone quickly tell me what time it is? I don't want to talk too long. Oh, sorry. I'll go on for maybe another 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll just take questions if there are some. As I said, the book started when I began researching private military firms, and these are the firms that now go out and train foreign armies. They are licensed by the State Department, so it's really an extension of foreign policy. But they can do this much more discreetly than the Pentagon. I mean, if the Pentagon does it, they have to have a press announcement, and the Pentagon has to answer questions if journalists call up and want to know what they're doing in Honduras. Of course, I mean, I'm being a little bit generous here. The Pentagon and the CIA are never terribly forthcoming about what they're doing, and they frequently don't reveal. They reveal as little as possible, but there's some level of accountability in theory anyway. With a private firm, it's a whole different story, and it's the same concept of no fingerprints, I think. If a private firm trains the army of Croatia, which I'll get to in a minute, this did happen, in 1995, when there's a war going on there, I bet a lot of you here, even people who are very knowledgeable about politics and national security, I bet many people here don't know that Military Professional Resources, Inc. Trained the Croatian army, that this private firm worked for Croatia in the mid-90s during the war there. You all would have known about it if the Pentagon would have done it. Again, not because the Pentagon is so forthcoming, but because it would have been a public mission, and there would have been some press scrutiny, and there would have been some public scrutiny. But because it was done by a private firm, I'm willing to wager 99% of the American public has no idea that ever took place. I want to just quickly read you a couple of want ads I found on the websites of some of these private firms. Here's one. Team leader, successful experience in force management and leadership positions, able to develop and implement a system for force integration for a foreign nation that is tailored to that nation's unique requirements, able to interact effectively with U.S. and foreign officials, able to build credibility and trust with foreign military leaders. Preferences for a former colonel experienced in armor and artillery systems. Here's another one. Trainer. Requirement for former U.S. Army personnel to support training of African forces in peace operations and humanitarian assistance operations. This program places importance on experience and training in battalion and brigade level operations and staff procedures to include rapid deployment, combined joint operations, peacekeeping, humanitarian operations, and training management. Additionally, experience in Africa useful. So these are sort of weird, I think, want ads. This is not the sort of want ad you expect to see in the Washington Post. And to the best of my knowledge, these firms don't actually advertise in the Post. But everybody who is in the business, everybody who is a former military man who's looking for work knows about those firms. They know to go to the websites or to Army Times, Navy Times, Air Force Times, or any of these publications where firms like that advertise. There's an informal but very sophisticated network where former military men can go to find work, and so they all know how to find these firms. The American firms that do this are somewhat different. I'm sure most of you have heard of Executive Outcomes, the South African firm that in theory is disbanded, but it was a firm that actually provided troops on the ground, so that the governments of Angola and Sierra Leone actually hired real live dogs of war, mercenaries from Executive Outcomes, soldiers, pilots who fought for those governments. They paid them generally with mining revenue or mining rights. So the government of Sierra Leone basically bankrupted itself by giving Executive Outcomes a bunch of, I think it was diamond rights in Sierra Leone. The U.S. firms are somewhat different. They don't actually provide troops. They provide trainers. But there's a very, very modest distinction there, I think. It is true that you're not going to actually have these soldiers directing combat operations. although they do get involved in borderline situations, as we'll see, and some of them have been killed in action, although it's never been reported as such. But they train, they basically train the trainers. So they go in and train high-ranking officers to go train their soldiers. And, why are we training the government of Croatia in 1995? Whether we're providing the troops or simply the training for that army, to me it's troubling when you have a private firm doing that because, again, there's just absolutely no accountability. The public isn't aware of it, and so there's virtually no oversight in Congress. I think I forgot to mention this. With these private firms, you've got some low-level civil servant overlooking these firms, not a congressional committee, not any sort of strict congressional oversight at all, because the firms generally conduct fairly small contracts in terms of dollar, 15, 20, 30, 50 million dollars. This is not going to attract a lot of attention in Congress. In any case, some of the examples of these firms there's Venel, which trains the Saudi Arabian National Guard. It's done that for the last 20 years. It's probably the oldest firm offering this type of service. Venel is actually owned by TRW. Until a few years ago, it was owned by another of these alphabet soup firms, BDM, but then TRW bought BDM, so now it's a subsidiary of TRW. And then there's DynCorp, which is a billion-dollar firm out in Virginia. It does a whole bunch of different things. It doesn't just do this private military training. It's involved in information technology, computer work, all sorts of stuff. It's staffed by a lot of former spooks and Pentagon officials, but they have a fairly diverse agenda. But again, I'd ask you, and I'm talking to people who I think are very well informed, how many people here knew that in 1996, I believe it was, an American airman was shot down by the Shining Path in Peru? Probably very few of you know that. The reason you don't know it is because this man worked for DynCorp. He worked for a private firm that was in Peru, supposedly repairing helicopters that were on loan to Peruvian anti-drug police from the State Department. But in fact, these guys were involved. They were involved in combat flights. And curiously, the man who was shot down is named Robert Hitchman. All I found on this in the press, if you can do a LexisNexis search on this incident, you'll find about 10 little filler items that big, that a guy who worked for DynCorp was shot down when he was doing some anti-drug, I can't remember exactly what the explanation was. It had nothing to do with, the Shining Path or involved in combat or anything like this. But, I think it was some sort of crop duster where they were spraying cocoa plants or something like that. Well, these reports were based purely, as far as I can tell, on the DynCorp press release. Nobody even looked and saw who Robert Hitchman was. If journalists had looked into it, Hitchman, it turns out, was a former Air American pilot. Air America was the CIA Air Force during the war in Indochina in the 60s and 70s. He went on to work for Ed Wilson, who is now at the Allenwood Federal Penitentiary because he was busted for selling arms to Muammar Gaddafi back in the 70s and early 80s. So this is a guy who has quite a checkered past. It just seemed bizarre to me when I found that out, that, gee, he's just, down there repairing helicopters. I located his son in California, and his son said he wasn't repairing helicopters. They were flying with Peruvian pilots. He was shot down by Shining Path. The government knew it. He said that he was called directly. The son was called by James Baker, then Secretary of State, who asked him not to talk to the press and to please not discuss the situation because it would be too embarrassing. And the son said to me they didn't want the public to know that the United States was directly involved in the drug wars in Latin America. And so here you have a case where if it had been a Pentagon operation, this would have been a big story, probably would have made the nightly news. That U.S. airmen shot down in Peru. I'm betting it's the lead story on all the networks. But nobody reported it. No one knows about it because it was done by a private firm. The other firm that I want to talk about a little bit is called Military Professional Resources, Inc. It was recently purchased, I believe, but it was started by 20 former high-ranking 3- and 4-star generals, very, very well-connected people. Guys who used to run the Defense Intelligence Agency and, were 4 stars over in Europe, people who directly ran, the war in the Persian Gulf. So we're talking about some of the top officers. And they are breaking into Eastern Europe, and they're trying to in a big way now. They have contracts in Africa, including Nigeria, and I am told that they have a contract now in Colombia that maybe someone here has more detail on about than me. But I believe they also are working in Colombia. But the episode I want to talk about briefly, and then I'll bring this to a close, is Croatia. In the mid-'90s, of course, we all remember the terrible war in the Balkans. And, you know, without getting into the complexities of that war or taking sides, you know, I think it's fair to say that none of the three warring parties, the Bosnians, the Serbs, or the Croats, were models for anyone. And they all had committed their various shares of human rights abuses. But the United States wanted to support the Croatians and didn't want to do it too publicly because the Croatian army had a terrible, and the government itself was led by a former fascist. The Croatian army has a terrible, terrible record going all the way back to the Second World War when Croatia was allied with Hitler. I mean, the Croatians fought side by side with Hitler against the Serbs, actually, who the Yugoslavs who opposed Hitler. And we wanted to take sides, but we wanted to do it sort of quietly, and we wanted to side with the Bosnian Muslims. So MPRI gets a contract. There were three firms that bid on it. The United States basically told the Croatians, you've got to hire a U.S. firm. We'll supply you with arms, but you've got to hire a U.S. firm to do the training. And it was MPRI, BDM, and SAIC, which is another one of these beltway firms. And MPRI won the contract. So they go into Croatia, and they are training officers over there, ostensibly in human rights indoctrination. And basically, as I was told by an official at MPRI, the role of an army in a democracy. But coincidentally, 2 months after MPRI arrives, the Croatian army suddenly has become a much more effective fighting force. I mean, this had been an army that had been pretty much bumbling, incompetent army, was getting routed on the battlefield. And a few months later, they're much more precise. They are running much more sophisticated combat operations. One of them was called Operation, I think it was Lightning Storm, and it was a blitzkrieg through the Krajina region of Yugoslavia, resulted in some of the worst human rights abuses of the whole war. Tens of thousands of people left homeless, villages burned, hundreds of people killed. And MPRI always denied that it was responsible for this training or responsible for had anything to do with this operation. But to anybody who was watching the situation on the ground in the Balkans at the time, it's just too mysterious that suddenly an army that hadn't been very effective has trainers come in, becomes more effective, but the trainers have nothing to do with it. No one who was on the ground at the time actually believes it. And so this is the sort of situation where, again, if the U.S. government wants to take sides, I believe it ought to go before the population, go before the public, and announce its intentions to do so, and let there be a public debate on it. And let the people have some input into whether we want to get involved in that sort of a situation. But that's too scary because the public really doesn't have the stomach for a lot of overseas entanglements. In fact, I talked to, in researching the book, I went to a Soldier of Fortune convention out in Las Vegas and talked to a bunch of these guys who, the old Soldier of Fortune has pretty much been replaced by the corporate mercenary. I mean, I think the old guys who used to get involved in these weird episodes abroad now sign up with an MPRI-style firm. But Bob Brown, the editor of Soldier of Fortune magazine, spoke favorably of these sorts of firms, and he said it's, you know, because anytime an American soldier gets killed overseas, the crying mother appears on the TV cameras, and then the population doesn't want to get involved abroad anymore. And I think that's the same rationale that the Pentagon has in using these firms. Bob Hitchman was an American who died in Peru, but, you know, if Bob Hitchman's mom had gone before the cameras, or if the event had attracted attention and the public would have said, hey, do we really want to be getting involved in the drug wars down in Peru? What are we doing down there? It might have created a debate with unfriendly consequences for foreign policy planners. And I think often national security planners don't want debate. They want to do what they want to do without having to be accountable to the public. Hence, this whole issue of privatization and how privatization feeds secrecy, I think, is one of the most important aspects of this new trend that I talk about in the book. And with that, I probably have talked far too long, but I will be happy to take questions if people have any.
Thank you, Ken. That was very interesting. I guess one of my questions is how new is what's going on now? Because you talk about the fact that there have been arms dealers forever. There have been these CIA cutouts and front companies, and we've had, there were Americans killed in Central America, covert operations in the 80s, and so on in Africa, and et cetera, et cetera. And so what is there something that's besides the fact that they have websites and they wear suits and ties now and lobby in Congress? I mean, is there something that is really new that's going on now?
I think it's a good question, because this is not something wholly original, but I think it's a question of, partly it's a question of scope and size. I mean, you have now these huge mega firms, billion-dollar corporations involved in these sorts of operations in work that was previously handled by little CIA cutouts. And I think it does matter. That does make a difference. Again, even if you had the CIA handling it, and that was partly, of course, for reasons of secrecy, I think this is even more, in some ways, it's even more impenetrable. And the fact that you're outsourcing, I mean, if the CIA is doing it, whether we like it or not, it's still a government operation. It's still being done by the public sector. I think the scary thing to me about this is that you have the private sector entering into the halls of war making. And you have, okay, we can debate privatization all we want. Should private firms be collecting the trash? Should they be collecting tolls on highways? We might well disagree with that. But what less appropriate role is there than for a private firm to be involved in war making? I mean, I suppose if you had private firms carrying out executions, that would be the only thing I can think of that would be comparably inappropriate and completely bizarre. But this, to me, just creates a much greater, because the CIA is not going to stop doing what it's doing anyway. This is just a new way and a bigger way and a way that allows for even greater secrecy in conducting the foreign policy. So I do think it's different in scope and size. I think there are a whole lot more people now. I mean, during the Cold War, you had this enormous buildup of this Cold War apparatus, billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of people under arms. That's been downsized. And so I think this is new, too, is that you have an enormous number of people who've been pushed off into the private sector who are now entering into these areas that were previously reserved for government. Even if we didn't like the old policies, and even if we didn't clearly have full control over the old policies, this is a way that the public has even less involvement, input, and oversight of what the United States does abroad and at home.
Just to follow up a little bit, I mean, it seems to me that what I'm wondering is how do we know that these are really wholly private companies? I mean, Air America, a lot of these CIA front companies looked as if, operated as if they were wholly private companies, and it was only through, digging in congressional hearings and journalistic work and so on that it was revealed that they were actually CIA front companies.
Some of them are just way too big. DynCorp is a multi-billion-dollar firm. I mean, the CIA or the Pentagon is not going to spend a couple of $1 billion to set up a front company of that size. DynCorp is now private, but for a time it was a public company. You could have bought stock in DynCorp. You could have become a rich DynCorp millionaire, perhaps. So I think, and some of the other firms too, they're very big companies. They're just far too huge, and they do far too much to be strictly cutouts, strictly CIA front companies. In terms of arms dealers, though I didn't address that, that in a way is a the two chapters I devoted to the arms trade, it's a slightly different issue, really. I included those chapters because I thought it was really fascinating and interesting to write about and to research. But it's a little bit different than they were always private, so this is not a new trend in the terms of privatization. But I guess I wanted to write about this because it shows the continued existence of the old Cold War networks. I mean, you set up, the CIA sets up all of these networks during the Cold War so that we can carry out secret operations here and move arms there and, overthrow governments there. And those networks, in many cases, are still up and running, and particularly in the area of the arms trade. And so I really wanted to write and show the continuity of the sort of Cold War way of doing business with the arms trade. So you and then you.
sort of tick off a few policy changes that would logically flow from this analysis if we were mindful to build a better world?
Well, I'm always fearful of that question because I have so little in the area of prescription here, and that's partly because it's hard to come, when you don't even know exactly what's happening, it's hard to say what to do to remedy that, a situation you're not fully informed about. But any full disclosure of arms deals is essential. I mean, these black deals should strictly be outlawed. I mean, there's no reason that if the United States cannot step forward and say we're going to send the Somali government 580 tons of arms and publicly announce its intentions, again, we may disagree with the policy and we may oppose the policy, but if the government comes out and says that it's going to do it, it is a different situation, I think, than when you simply say, well, we're too cowardly to actually say what we're going to do, so we're going to do it the secret way. So one, you should have a crackdown on these black market arms deals, and the whole black budget is clearly, I think, unconstitutional. I mean, we're supposed to have a right to know how all of our money is spent. The black budget, it's precisely the opposite. It's a secret budget inside the budget. So, there's a line item that says, I'm making this up, but for example, $2 billion to pay for, new base infrastructure. Well, actually, it doesn't go for base infrastructure. It goes for a secret program that the government doesn't want us to know about. I never was able to determine precisely what was the size of the Foreign Material Acquisition Program for precisely this reason. It never published its budget. In fact, it doesn't even exist. I wrote about it, but it formally doesn't even exist. So, you're not supposed to know about the FMA program. But I was told by one of the players that it was about $100 million a year. But this person said, he said, there's it was something to the effect that, whenever you needed money, you could always get it. If you had a big enough deal, like if you were the T-72 Russian tank, we hunted for that tank for years through the FMA program. Finally got it in the early 80s. A arms dealer, an Icelandic arms dealer named Loftur Johannesson, got it out of East Germany. And, he said if you had a T-72 you could buy, you could always get the money. He said, it's a democracy, but there are ways of being creative. So, this is the way the whole thing was run. You just didn't put it there was no budget item for FMA or no budget item for T-72 tanks. And that, I think, should be eliminated, that whole idea of there being a secret budget. And I guess the other thing that you'd want to look at is these private firms should be, if you're going to use private firms, they should at least be held to the same standards of accountability, minimal accountability, I would point out, as official training programs are held to. So that they ought to be required to report on their activities, and public has a right to know what they're doing instead of it being done secretly. One of the things I found out that was ironic in researching this book is, the Freedom of Information Act, which is highly overrated. I mean, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request on Ernst Werner Glott to the CIA, and the reply, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is basically it in a nutshell. I got a letter back from the CIA saying, we're not saying we know Glott, we're not saying we don't know Glott, but if we know Glott, we won't talk about him. So, that was really helpful. And with these private firms, I filed a FOIA on that, and I was told in the response back that they couldn't give me any information, the State Department, because that's the appropriate department to petition to, because they oversee these private firms. They said, well, gee, we're sorry, we can't help you. They're private firms. It's proprietary information. We can't tell you what we're doing, because their competitors could find out. And so it creates this loophole and this exemption in the FOIA even that makes it all the more difficult to find out what's going on. And so I guess because we're talking about secrecy, the obvious answer is greater oversight, greater accountability, greater sunshine. And I guess I'd leave that to the policymakers to figure out what would be the best way to do that. So you had a question?
Yes, I was wondering about how many people are employed by these private military firms, And about how big do you think the black budget is?
Well, both of those I can't give you an answer for. I wish I could, but this is, of course, the whole dilemma of research. Yeah, it's secret. It's pure. The black budget, even the CIA budget, is a secret. I mean, it's estimated that the CIA budget, I think, is about $30 or $35 billion.
The whole intelligence budget, which includes the CIA and all the other.
So, how much? Is there a figure on it?
Yeah, it's about 28 million, 28
billion. Yeah. I don't know what the black budget is. There was a book by Tim Weiner on the black budget a few years ago, and I've forgotten the name. Black budget. There we go. Black budget. How could that have escaped me? But in any case, that was a really excellent look at the whole black budget. Though you should certainly buy my book before buying Tim's book. And in terms of the size of these foreign armies, again, I don't know. I did speak to people who worked for them, and I talked to people who worked in Bosnia and Croatia, and they told me about the size of the of the specific missions. And this is actually it's. I'm glad you reminded me to talk about this a little. I can't give you an answer to your question, but let me talk about something else. What's interesting about these private armies is that they can train a whole army. I mean, the U.S. sends military professional resources into Croatia. They send hundreds of officers. They can effectively train virtually the entire army of Croatia. The biggest Pentagon program I found, and this was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, was a couple of hundred people in Honduras. But most of our, and they train battalions and specific units, and they're involved in sort of, relatively speaking, small scale stuff. But and that was the big one. But most of them are 10, 5, 15 people. But a company can send hundreds of people. They could send thousands of people if they needed to, and so there's no limit in terms of how it's a way of influencing a broader body of the foreign government, of the foreign government security forces, and so that's another one of the more troubling things about it.
Were there any interesting things that you discovered concerning private contract employee involvement in the Middle East?
Excuse me, private
employee, private firm, private army involvement in the Middle East?
Well,
say from Pakistan to Morocco, including North.
Most of the involvement I found was not in the Middle East. There is some. I mean, the MPRI went to, or in that part of the world, MPRA went to Sri Lanka at one point, and they were negotiating over there, but that deal apparently fell apart when it became public in Sri Lanka. This is what I had heard. Vanel is in Saudi Arabia. I know there have been private firms in Kuwait. But mostly what I found was a lot of these companies, especially MPRI, are trying to break into Eastern Europe and have broken into Eastern Europe to a certain degree, and Africa. I mean, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, even had 2 years ago a forum at the Key Bridge Marriott, which is where I think every time a CIA agent comes to town from abroad, they put him up at the Key Bridge Marriott, apparently. But they had a conference out there on the privatization of military training. And MPRI spoke there, a representative from that firm, as well as representatives from Executive Outcomes, which at the time was still doing business under its own name. They say Executive Outcomes has broken up, but I'm told it is broken into smaller parts. And they had representatives of Sandline, which is a British firm that got in a bunch of trouble. They were in Papua New Guinea, and they were exposed over there. The government hired them secretly to put down a rebellion. The population found out. These guys, apparently, I think what happened was they turned up at the airport and nobody had passports. And they said, well, don't worry about that. It's in our contract. We can come in without passports. And somehow, somebody at customs in Papua New Guinea got upset about it, and the press found out, and then Sandline was driven out, basically literally chased out of the country. But they had a bunch of these firms speaking, at this conference, along with private security consultants to big corporations like Texaco and Shell, I think, had officials there. And that's another thing. These firms also provide corporate security. So, for example, there's a firm, one of the firms I didn't get to talk about before is called AirScan, which is based down in Florida. And one of the officers that runs that is the guy who ran covert operations in El Salvador, General Joe Stringham. He ran covert ops during the 80s, and he works for AirScan. And on their website, they talk about how, they have a secret client list because their clients like discretion. But they've been involved in Angola, providing, they do reconnaissance and surveillance so that if they spot guerrilla trouble, they sort of basically let the Angolan army know, and the Angolan army then brings in its own troops to handle any sort of infiltration into the oil zone. And that's one of these interesting things too about all of this, is that in Angola, the United States doesn't really care about Angola. We did during the Cold War only because we wanted Angola was allied with the Soviet Union at the time, and we didn't like that. But we care about the oil in Angola. We buy a lot of oil there, and so basically you have an enclave, an economic enclave situation over there in Angola where the oil is protected by this U.S. firm, and that's the priority, is to make sure that we keep the oil flowing to the United States and to the other Western nations. So these firms not only work for the U.S. government, but they can also work for private companies as well.
First, just a comment, as you've been talking, I've been thinking about the fact that here at IPS for 25 years or so, we've been trying to find out the details of the U.S. government's support of Pinochet in Chile, and what a battle that has been, but at least we're getting some payoff. But these are government entities, and so to imagine if all of this had been done by private firms, it would probably be impossible, right? They wouldn't keep the same kind of records that we're trying to get a hold of from the government. So it's making it very clear in my head what we're talking about as far as what the public will be able to find out about what we're doing now and 25 years from now. But my question is, do you have much of a sense of what percentage of these private deals are carrying out the dirty business, like you said, that at least some elements in the U.S. national security operations are in favor of, but would be too embarrassed to publicize, versus how many are more like the one you described with the guy stirring up trouble between Greece and Turkey just to make a profit that's not really related to U.S. interests?
Well, that sort of stuff, the Basil Zaharoff episode, is pretty much a thing of the past. I mean, governments are much more, before, in the early part of the century, it really was private companies. There was very little government oversight at the time, and so the companies could do whatever they wanted, and they really did influence public policy in a much bigger way than now, because governments do operate more control over the private arms makers, and so there's less of that goes on. It's impossible to know, again, your question too, I couldn't provide a specific answer for, in terms of how much black market arms dealing is going on. It's hard to know. The best estimate I saw was from Jane's, the British publication, which very well connected and very informative about these matters, and they estimated it from $1 billion a year to $10 billion a year. Pretty broad range there, but that's the best estimate of the size of the black market arms trade. In terms of secrecy, your comment, it's a good point, because you're right, the government won't even have the relevant materials in many cases. The relevant materials are in the company's ledger sheets, They know what they spent, they know who they sent over, they know the size of the mission. The government probably won't even have all of that detail. My understanding is that the firms don't operate completely without, they do report to the State Department, and they have to issue some sort of accounting to the State Department, which, as I found, was made off limits because it was proprietary. But surely they're not, reporting day-to-day operations, and, they have information that no doubt the government won't have itself. The other thing I forgot, I mentioned the response I got from the CIA on GLOT. I want to talk again, too, about this whole issue of secrecy. Gerhard Mertens, the other arms dealer I talked about, I filed a request to Army intelligence on Mertens, and I got back this great reply. We've got 6,000 pages on Gerhard Mertens. I said, wonderful. I want it. And they said, okay, it'll cost you $900, 15 cents a page. And I said, good, I'll pay it. I will give you $900 because I want the 6,000 pages. 7 months later, it keeps dragging on and on and on and on. They tell me it's going to take a while. They have to review it. They might have to make a few blackouts, because they don't want to reveal sources, and they got to be So thank you. Sources and methods. They have to be real careful about that. They got to go through and delete the sources and methods, and then they'll turn it over to me. It goes on and on and on. And finally, I don't know, I think it's 7 or 8 months later, they said, well, we've completed a review, and all 6,000 pages are off limits. Like, well, gee, so 6,000 pages of sources and
You
methods.
saved $900.
Yeah, I saved $900, but I lost the 6,000 pages. And so, yeah, to me, this is outrageous. I mean, Gerhard Mertens is dead. He died in 1993. I wrote about him partly because his story was so interesting, but also because without going into a lot of detail here, there were 3 people who worked with him who still work in the arms business, and so his sort of arms legacy continues to this day. But, you know, the guy died in 1993. The Cold War is over. There is no reason to keep all of this secret. And in fact, Congress a couple of years ago passed something called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. Gerhard Mertens was a Nazi. He was recruited by Army intelligence in the 1950s. I did get some Freedom of Information Act stuff that, ironically, a German researcher gave to me about Mertens. They gave him stuff that they wouldn't give me. And so that's how I learned that he was a funder and a sympathizer of the Socialist Reich Party at the very time that he's recruited by U.S. Army intelligence. And so, you know, how could 6,000 pages be top secret about a man who's dead, and when we're going back 50 years? It just defies all belief, but this is the way that the intelligence agencies operate. The less you know, the better. Mm-hmm.
You know, I was just going to say, in terms of what are the policy implications of this, besides the fact that so much of this information we'll never be able to get our hands on because it's private. I think another thing that I've heard, particularly in terms of executive outcomes in some of the operations in Africa, is that, you know, thank God they were there. The UN couldn't decide to go in. You know, the international community was just incapable of acting. And so thank God this company could go in really fast and, you know, sort of stabilize things. And I think that, one, that's just a tragic commentary on international peacekeeping operations and what we're able to do. And two, the reality is that where these companies go, as you've indicated, is only where there's real wealth. So they go to protect the diamond mines, the oil fields, and so on. If there's fighting, as you know, in Rwanda and Burundi, where there's no wealth, they're not going to be there. So that it's not as if they're kind of serving, you know, as kind of a third arm to to international peacekeeping operations. But that's the way they build themselves, and that, I think, in a number of countries where the situation has just been, the international community has been so inept, they have looked to these private armies as, you know, sort of a savior in a way, and that really is just tragic that we're at that point.
Well, you've pretty much said what I would say, so I'll only comment briefly. But you've hit the nail on the head. These companies and their defenders are always saying, you know, thank God these firms did this. I mean, the international community was immobilized, so executive outcomes went into Sierra Leone. Or you'll hear 200 men with a couple of helicopters could have prevented the whole genocide in Rwanda. And this is correct in both cases. The problem is that it's just a way of shunning responsibility. So why couldn't the international community do it? Why couldn't the international community have mustered up 200 men and put them into Rwanda to prevent the genocide? Because, precisely as you've said, there wasn't a big enough stake. Nobody wanted to have U.S. soldiers or anybody's soldiers killed when there wasn't oil at stake or something that made it worth, in the eyes of the government, sending troops over. And so, I think it's a really dangerous argument, because it's a way of saying, well, intervention is good in some cases, and so if governments won't do it, let's have somebody else do it. But these companies work for governments. If they can do it, then the government can do it in the name of their own populations, and that's the way it should be done. I mean, you just should not have warfare and foreign policy being run by private companies that have a profit at stake. I mean, it's crazy. It reminds me of, you know, private prison companies, which is another area that's just, to me, totally ludicrous. I mean, you build a private prison. You have stockholders. You're a private company, and it's like a hotel. If the beds aren't filled, you're losing money. And so you hear all sorts of weird stories about prisoners at private prisons who, they find that they can't get good time off for good behavior. And you have to wonder if that's not a way of keeping the beds filled. Now, I mention that only because it's an inherent conflict in that field, and I believe it's an inherent conflict in the field of war and peacekeeping. The profit dynamic, to me, is not something you want to introduce into war. And so that's one of the big problems.
Is there any reason to think that the upcoming elections could have an effect on these issues? Have you noticed any difference in positions among the major candidates?
No, I mean, the Gore and Bush, first off, it's not even an issue that's on the radar screen. Even the Pentagon and the whole ridiculous defense budget of almost $300 billion a year when, Cuba and North Korea and Iraq have replaced the Soviet Union now as the great threats to national security. I mean, to be spending that sort of money is crazy, but neither one of the leading contenders is talking about that issue, and even less about the whole role of secret operations and privatization of military training or military services, period. So I'd love to give you the sort of optimistic answer of, oh, yeah, this is, as soon as George Bush takes office or Al Gore takes office, this is the first thing on their agenda. But they're not challenging anything about our national security policy, so to challenge something like this that nobody's talking about anyway, I don't see it coming up at all.
But I think just to add to that, that's one of the reasons that your book is so important, and we are trying, with your help and help of others, to try to raise this issue in Congress. That's what Eric has been working on, and to really try to start some kind of debate about the privatization of the military and what are the foreign policy implications of it. So if any of you are interested, see Eric or me afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
The culture that has grown up around this militarization, is there any part of it that you don't see tied in with lying and deception and secrecy? How do you see that? Just a matter of integrity and straightforwardness, openness. If that would change, how would that affect the future?
Well, I think it would affect the future in terms of the type and number of overseas entanglements that the United States finds itself in. Again, just to go back, it's an old episode, but the Somalia episode I talked about, that wouldn't have happened if not for the fact that it could be done in secret. And look at what happened to Somalia. I mean, Somalia was a proxy in the Cold War. There was a repressive government there, but the United States decided that it was useful to line up the support of the Somalis to combat the Soviet Union. Billions of dollars worth of arms are shipped into Somalia during the Cold War, which at the end of the Cold War, when the Cold War is over and no one cares about Somalia anymore. And in fact, there was a quote, I quote in the book, this was actually something that was told to the Washington Post. An army officer or an intelligence officer is quoted in the Washington Post in, I think, about 95 as saying, what the Somalis don't get anymore is that nobody gives a shit about them anymore. Which is really true. Once the Cold War was over, we didn't care about Somalia. And so, meanwhile, though, we'd sent in billions of dollars worth of arms. The government collapses. These arms end up in the hands of all of these competing parties, and the country falls into a state of complete and utter chaos and anarchy. The same thing happens with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I mean, here are our great friends that are going to fight the Soviet Union. Of course, they detest the United States, and they detest, the whole idea of, they're certainly not fighting for democracy over there. They weren't fighting for democracy. They were fighting to drive out the Russians. And there's another country that's fallen into a state of complete and utter chaos, again, because you just had an unbelievable amount of weapons shipped in to those areas. I mean, in the case of Afghanistan, we sent them these Stinger anti-air rockets, and now that the Cold War is over, we're desperately trying to buy them back. The CIA has its own little program to buy them back because we're afraid that our former friends will blow up a 747. I'm just not sure that you'd have the level of stupidity if there was some sort of public oversight of these operations. And if the government had to make its case to the people, I'm not sure they'd even have the. I'm not sure they'd be willing to come before the cameras and try to make a case for some of the operations that have been carried out in secret.
Well, you know, I'm wondering too if you've obviously had much more exposure and contact with CIA and former CIA, KGB agents. My own limited experience is that when I've met these people, they really do seem to have a trouble dealing with truth. I mean, it seems like, you know, their own personality has been maybe forever altered, compromised, and I don't know what, you know, how you would evaluate that, but even among themselves, they seem to have more respect, you know, for, you know, even when they might have been enemies, they have more respect and kinship with each other than they would with, you know, so-called normal population of people.
Well, I think there's an issue when you operate in this sort of weird world of cutouts and fake names and, you know, dummy bank accounts and everything else. It probably does have a certain amount of influence. I mean, I was talking to Charles Kerr, who was one of the Senate investigators into the Iran-Contra affair, and he told me that he spoke to one arms dealer who he said, and I think this is a direct quote, I don't know what page it's on there, but he said, this guy had operated in the Hall of Mirrors for so long that he didn't know the difference between fact and fiction himself anymore. And so, you know, perhaps there's something to that. I think, you know, when you operate in this strange world of secrecy, and when, you know, your public face is a false one, it probably creates a certain amount of confusion, if nothing else. So.
What makes you think that the private firms are doing any worse job than what the public firms would be doing for training issues? Like if we look at School of the Americas, which has historically been, you know, training death squad merchants abroad for years in Latin America, why would it be preferable to hold them in that arena when we can't even hold those people accountable, and we're holding award ceremonies over at the CIA for these folks?
Well, I'm not sure they're doing a worse job. I think they're doing a similar job, and that's the problem. It's another way of doing it. It's another way of doing it quietly. Hence, and because you can do it quietly, you're more emboldened to try to do it. I mean, a slight difference is that you mentioned the School of the Americas, which is the Pentagon program training Latin American officers who, you know, there's like a real hall of shame there. Some of these former officers who've graduated from the School of the Americas, like Noriega and the guy down in Bolivia, Hugo Banzer, and I mean, every sort of terrible dictator and horrible military officer seems to be a graduate of the SOA. At the same time, MPRI is involved in something called the African Crisis Response Initiative, which is, you know, an African peacekeeping force, which basically means it's a force for intervention that does what the United States wants it to do, since we're training it. And Dan Nelson, this former State Department Pentagon official I talked to, said, this is just like the School of the Americas, only now we're making house calls. You know, we set up the training over there, you know, that the officers don't come here, we go there. And so I'm not sure the outcome is any different, but certainly it's more of the same and another sort of means to do something that perhaps the population wouldn't want the government to be doing. So why don't I just take one more question, since it's about...
I was wondering if you talked about the international competition to American firms. Where is it mostly coming from? And with the end of the Cold War, do you have the same problem in Russia? I know that many of the Russian former spooks are now involved in, you know, criminal acts and non-international, non-military aspects. Are they in the same realm, in the same market?
Well, this is a good question. This is a worldwide phenomenon. You've got all sorts of companies, not just American, in fact, mostly non-American firms involved in these sort of strange, mysterious operations abroad. The Israelis do a lot of it. I mean, there was one firm, I think it was called Levden, it's in chapter 5 of the book, where you had a former Israeli officer named Yair Klein who turns up in Colombia training the private forces of a cocaine baron. And during the training, they chanted, there was some chant they had about drinking the blood of communists. It was a paramilitary firm working for this drug lord. And then he turned up in Sierra Leone, and he was arrested there, actually. He went over there to train the Revolutionary United Front, this group that specialty is chopping off the limbs of its victims. You've got British firms doing this, South African firms, Russians. There were Russians and Serbs, I believe, who turned up in Zaire or in the Congo when Mobutu was ousted. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. And I suspect that in Israel and South Africa and some of these other countries, you might even have, relatively speaking, more of this going on than you do in the United States. So, and with that, we should probably bring things to a close. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.